Okay, so think about this. What if everything we assume about women's deepest desires, well, what if it's been kind of shaped, maybe even limited by society?
That's a powerful question to start with.
Right. And today we're going deep into that hidden world, the landscape of female sexuality. We're using Nancy Friday's book, Women on Top, How Real Life Has Changed Women's Sexual Fantasies, as our guide.
Yeah, that book, it was published in New Zealand and South Africa, and it really gives an incredibly close look at women's inner thoughts, specifically their sexual fantasies.
She calls it a report from the erotic interior. I like that
Me
phrase.
too. It's just this collection of voices, really, showing the diverse and sometimes pretty surprising reality of that erotic interior.
Exactly. So our mission here for this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from all this material. We want to give you a clearer picture of, the complexities, the nuances of female sexual psychology.
Without getting totally bogged down in all the details.
Right. Cut through the noise, get to the heart of it.
Okay, but to really get what Women on Top is showing us, we kind of need the backstory, the historical context.
Definitely.
The book talks about how for, well, centuries, women's sexuality was pushed down, suppressed, and it wasn't just external pressure.
No, women actually internalized it. Friday says they became one another's jailers.
It's a striking image, isn't it? And think about those old stories like Sleeping Beauties.
Uh-huh. The woman just waiting to be awakened by a man.
Right. The book suggests that whole narrative was maybe about managing this deep-seated societal fear about women's true desires, a feel that if women's appetites were really
It
acknowledged.
could upset the whole power balance, their insatiable appetites, as the book puts it.
Exactly. And look, things have changed, obviously. We've made progress.
Sure.
But the book points out that real, deep societal acceptance, that takes generations. It's slow.
And that creates tension, right? Especially for mothers.
Yeah, exactly. Mothers who maybe fought for this freedom themselves, but then struggle with how to pass it on to their daughters without feeling like they're putting them in jeopardy. It's a conflict.
It's like this lingering background noise,
Yeah.
this unconscious message Friday talks about,
Mm-hmm.
that even with all the apparent sexual freedom,
There's still this whisper.
yeah, that sex for the sake of pleasure is wrong, immoral, bad.
And being aware of that kind of ingrained repression, especially for women trying to figure out their own desires, it's vital.
Friday even talks about her own experience with this, doesn't she?
She does. She mentions a time when she sort of downplayed sex in her own life. Why? To get approval from people she saw as enemies of sex.
Wow. That really shows how deep that internal conflict can go.
It does. And then there's the bit about her friends.
Oh, yeah, the ones who said they didn't have sexual fantasies.
Right. And they dismissed her books, saying something like, "Another one of your masturbatory books, Nancy."
Huh? Tells you a lot, doesn't it? The sheer range of how comfortable women were or weren't with this stuff, even among close friends.
Absolutely. So, okay, maybe we should dive into some of the big themes.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Where should we start? Maybe with masturbation. That's always been a bit charged, especially for women.
Definitely. Historically, female masturbation was, well, a massive taboo.
Why, though? What was the fear?
It was tied to autonomy, really. The idea that a woman could find sexual satisfaction on her own without needing a man or a relationship.
Ah, so it threatened the traditional setup.
Precisely. It suggested control over her own body, her own pleasure, and that wasn't part of the plan, so to speak, in traditional patriarchal views.
But Friday's book shows a shift, right? The women she interviewed.
Oh, yeah. Many of them talk with this real ease about masturbation. They have this rich vocabulary to describe it. Their fantasies are soaring.
Making earlier writing on it seem almost tentative, she says.
Exactly. It really feels like a different era in terms of women connecting with their own sexuality.
But then Friday raises this concern, doesn't she, about potential regression?
Yeah, it's interesting and maybe a bit worrying. She wonders if this generation, when they become mothers, will they fully pass on that sexual freedom to their daughters?
Or will they kind of pull back, try to protect them by limiting things?
Right. Because of this cultural baggage we carry, a heritage, as Friday puts it, that was never comfortable with sex, rooted in like a Calvinist work ethic and a puritanical attitude.
Work over pleasure. Sex for babies, not for fun. That whole mindset.
Exactly. Condemning female enjoyment.
It's a sobering thought that progress isn't always linear. These old anxieties could pop up again.
Yeah. But on the flip side, the book really champions masturbation as
So,
well as a tool for self-discovery.
wow, so,
While it helps women understand their own bodies, their own desires, it builds self-sufficiency in that area. It can help separate sex from needing a partner all the time.
makes sense.
And, becoming more aware of what works for you can actually make you more orgasmic and maybe even a better, more communicative partner eventually.
Plus, fostering a better relationship with your own body. Acceptance.
Absolutely. Friday even shares that early memory of hers. Unconsummated masturbation, she calls it.
Right, like she stumbled upon pleasure but didn't quite know what it was or pursue it.
And she reflects on that, wondering why, even though she was rebellious in other ways, she didn't really explore her own body back then.
It feels very relatable, that kind of missed connection.
Mm-hmm. And for you listening, connecting this back, this historical unease with female masturbation, it just highlights the long road women have traveled to even claim ownership of their inner erotic lives. For so long, not exploring that meant being cut off from a core part of themselves.
Okay, so we've talked about the individual side, masturbation. Let's broaden out.
Mhm.
How do these desires, these fantasies play out in love, sex, relationships? The book gets into that complex mix too.
It really does. One key idea is these unconscious bargains women might make with men as adults.
Bargains, what kind?
Friday suggests they often stem from our very first love experience, the one with our mothers.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, think about those early dynamics. Needing care, depending on her, fearing her withdrawal. Those feelings can unconsciously shape what we expect and fear in our adult relationships.
So like a fear of your mother leaving might turn into a fear of your partner abandoning you.
Sort of, yeah. And you might make these unspoken deals, these bargains in the relationship to try and prevent that fear from coming true. It's deep stuff.
Wow. That connection to our earliest bonds,
Yeah.
it's powerful and often totally unspoken.
hmm And remember, we mentioned masturbation. The book notes how men and women often view it differently, which hints at maybe a fundamental difference in how they experience love and sex.
Okay. And what about this swept away phenomenon? That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, Friday identifies this pattern, especially in women raised to think sex isn't really their responsibility.
Like it's the man's domain.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So this conditioning can make them hesitant to, guide a partner or even say what they want during sex.
Like they're waiting for him to just know.
Exactly. It's this kind of learned passivity, this reluctance to seem too assertive sexually, that can really hold back a woman's agency in bed.
Yeah, I can see that. And the book also separates love and romance from just sex, right?
Mhm.
Saying they don't always have to go together.
Absolutely. It includes stories from women who are fine having sex with friends or finding satisfaction through masturbation, completely separate from any romantic feelings.
Which challenges that old idea that sex must equal love.
Totally. It allows for a broader spectrum of experience.
And what about after sex? The book mentions differences there too.
Yeah, it explores this common pattern where men might feel, refreshed, maybe more independent afterwards,
Mhm.
whereas women often feel a stronger need for reconnection, reassurance, closeness after intimacy.
And that difference can cause problems, I imagine.
For sure.
Unmet needs.
And the book even suggests that sometimes women might unconsciously punish men because they feel disempowered elsewhere in the relationship.
Punish them how?
Like maybe by excluding them from big decisions, say, about having kids. It's subtle, but it's about power dynamics playing out.
Okay, so these complex dynamics are happening in real life. Which brings us perfectly to how power plays out in women's fantasies.
Yeah.
That's where Women on Top gets really fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. The book gives these amazing examples of women's fantasies where they are the ones in control, dominating, subduing men even.
And this isn't just random, right? It connects to their real lives.
Often, yeah. Friday links it to women feeling more assertive in general, sometimes even correlating with climbing the career ladder.
You mean like the woman whose corporate success fueled fantasies of dominating opponents?
Exactly that one. It's such a vivid link between that inner erotic power and, outer confidence and agency. A really powerful insight.
It shows how fantasy can reflect, maybe even fuel, real-world changes. What about other power themes? Maternal dominance.
That's another interesting one that emerges. As women felt more okay exploring different kinds of power, fantasies about maternal dominance started showing up more.
Moving beyond just the benign and nurturing mother stereotype.
Right. Exploring the full spectrum of that power, even the part society finds uncomfortable or taboo.
But it's important to draw a line, isn't it? Between control in fantasy and actual cruelty.
Yes, absolutely. The book is clear on that. It's not about wanting to inflict pain. Think of that quote from Judith.
The one about wanting to be totally in charge.
Yeah, so she could feel the loss of control and orgasm more intensely.
Yeah,
It's about the experience of power and surrender, not about being cruel.
got it. And then there are fantasies reversing traditional roles, like women seducing priests.
Or virgins. These can be seen as a kind of potent rebellion against those really ingrained rules about who's supposed to be the sexual initiator, who holds the power traditionally.
It's like fantasy is this safe playground for breaking rules.
Exactly. Pushing boundaries, exploring things you never do in reality. Which leads us right into those forbidden desires the book covers.
Like exhibitionism.
Yeah, fantasies about being watched, often driven, Friday suggests, by a need for admiration, a desire to be seen as sexual beings, rejecting those old asexual stereotypes.
The fantasy about the older men at the beach resort really captures that, doesn't it?
It does. It's about claiming that visibility, almost defiantly.
And the flip side,
Yeah.
voyeurism. Fantasies of watching or being watched during sex.
Yes, including imagining being filmed. And what's interesting is how this can contrast sharply with how the same woman might appear in her everyday life. Very conservative, perhaps.
It highlights that gap between the inner world and the outer self. Fascinating. What about multiple partners?
The book covers that too. Fantasies with a whole range of dynamics. Sometimes the woman is dominant, sometimes submissive within the group. It just shows the variety of desires around power and connection.
And fantasies about other women. That seems like a really significant theme in the book.
It really is. Friday notes how much more common and accepted these female-female desires seem to be becoming in women's fantasy lives.
What's driving that, according to the book?
It could be many things. Sometimes a search for a different kind of pleasure or intimacy, maybe something they feel is missing with men. Sometimes it might stem from negative past experiences.
Or just a different kind of connection?
Exactly. The book shares this really intense, detailed fantasy a woman had about another woman after a breakup. It shows the emotional depth these fantasies can have. For listeners who've maybe felt that curiosity, Friday's work kind of normalizes it.
Yeah, it validates that search for connection on a different level. Okay, now, the book also tackles some tougher fantasy themes, right? Like involving force.
It does, and it approaches them with a lot of nuance. These are complex fantasies, no doubt.
What kind of links does Friday suggest?
They can be connected to things like anger, maybe a desire for revenge, or even a way to experience something forbidden without feeling personal guilt or responsibility.
Like Anna's fantasy of being dominant on top, or the woman fantasizing about being a helpless but rebellious slave girl.
Exactly. They show this complex tangle of power, desire, rebellion, submission.
And it's that forbidden element itself that can be the turn-on.
That's what Friday argues. She even talks about her own fantasies, often centering on defying authority, breaking those nice girl rules she felt constrained by as she grew up.
Exploring boundaries safely inside your own head.
Precisely. Now, slightly different angle, but related. Body image and objectification in fantasy.
How does that show up?
Well, fantasies focused on specific body parts, like large breasts, where that becomes the source of arousal both for the woman imagining it and the men in her fantasy.
It shows the complex relationship women have with their bodies, how they see themselves, and how that gets woven into their erotic thoughts.
Definitely. And the book talks about objectification too, fantasies, where the woman is the object of desire, but also where she is the one objectifying others.
And that connects to?
Sometimes feelings of loneliness, maybe, or again, that desire for control within the fantasy, like
Yeah.
the example of the woman using her breast to deliberately arouse her boss in her imagination.
Right. Taking the awareness of how she's seen and using it as a power play, but just internally.
Exactly. And we can't ignore media and culture in all this, can we?
No way. Erotica, porn.
Mm.
How does the book see their impact?
As significant. It affects women's fantasies, how they understand their own sexuality. There's a woman whose creativity was tied to a musician's voice.
And the one who just finds porn gets her horny fast.
Right. It shows how external things can plug into internal desires, help women connect with their erotic selves.
And what about visual arousal? Has that changed?
The book suggests it has. From initial doubt about whether women were even turned on by looking at naked men, to what Friday describes as a more unabashed gazing and arousal now, women feeling more free to look and appreciate the male form visually.
Breaking down those old rules about who gets to look and who is looked at?
Exactly. Now, the book also includes some, well, let's call them unconventional fantasies.
Okay. Like what?
Fantasies involving non-traditional partners, maybe nice old men or even animals.
Animals?
Yeah, there's an explicit fantasy involving a large dog mentioned. And while that might surprise some
Which
listeners,
in a way is.
it highlights the sheer diversity of erotic thought. These fantasies might tap into different things: vulnerability, nurturing desires, breaking taboos, maybe things we don't fully understand.
Pushing boundaries, making us think about what needs these fantasies might be meeting.
Right. And it also stresses how personal experiences shape fantasy. Like the woman with herpes fantasizing about being watched but not touched.
A way to navigate her reality within her fantasy life.
Hmm. Or how something negative, like a mother being very prudish, could actually fuel arousal in fantasy later on.
As rebellion.
As rebellion as reclaiming something, turning a negative into a source of private pleasure.
Transforming it in the mind. Okay, so as we kind of start to wrap up our dive into women on top, what's the big picture on the journey of female sexuality?
Well, a key point is that fantasies themselves don't really get dated. The core desires, the themes, they seem pretty enduring.
So what does change?
Repression, societal attitudes, that's what fluctuates. What we're seeing now, or what Friday saw then, is this increasing willingness for women to talk about, to explore their sexual curiosity.
Supported by other women. Solidarity.
Yes, that helps shift things away from just punishing women for sexual transgressions.
It creates more permission to be curious. And what about that female-to-female desire you mentioned? Even for straight women.
Yeah, the book sees that as a growing area of curiosity and fantasy pleasure. It might be linked to bad experiences with men or just seeking a different kind of intimacy they feel is missing.
A different connection.
Exactly. And you really feel the frustration in the book from women whose real partners just aren't meeting their needs, don't understand their desires.
And that fuels the fantasy life.
Massively. Like
Yeah.
the woman whose husband refuses oral sex, and that refusal directly feeds her really vivid fantasies where she does get what she wants.
Wow. So the fantasy becomes more fulfilling than reality in some ways.
It can be, yeah. Especially around control, getting exactly what you desire without needing to negotiate or compromise.
Okay, so summing this all up for everyone listening, this dive into women on top really paints this picture of female sexual fantasy as, well, incredibly diverse, really complex, often pretty surprising.
Shaped by everything: personal history, societal pressure, the ongoing search for autonomy, pleasure, connection.
And we see that stark contrast, don't we, between how things were historically suppressed.
And the way women are now exploring these erotic interiors, even if that exploration is still unfolding, still evolving.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. How could understanding all these nuances of female fantasy actually help us?
Could it lead to more self-awareness, maybe more honest conversations and relationships?
Perhaps a wider acceptance in society of the whole spectrum of human desire.
Maybe these hidden erotic interiors, now being brought more into the light, hold some important keys. Keys to understanding ourselves and each other more completely.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the forces shaping our own ideas about sex and the real power lying untapped in the world of fantasy.
Yeah. And this is just scratching the surface, really. There's always more to learn, more to discuss about how human sexuality keeps changing.